further ado, I'm going to spotlight both Jonathan and Margaret, and you can sit back and enjoy what is going to be a truly amazing discussion.
Thank you very much, Israel. We're delighted to welcome this evening Dame Margaret, who insists on Dame Margaret Hodge, who insists on being called Margaret. Margaret has been Member of Parliament for Barking since 1994. She's a member of the Labour Party, and she previously served as the leader of the Islington London Borough Council from 1982 to 1992. She held then a number of different ministerial positions in the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, becoming a Privy Councillor in 2003. Margaret then served as chairman of the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee from 2010 to 2015. And Margaret is talking us primarily tonight, though I think the agenda is open, on her fight with anti-Semitism, but may mention also her fight with the British National Party as well. I thought we could start, Margaret, by just talking a little bit about your background and your early life, your parents, and perhaps the Jewish influences in your background. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that introduction, Jonathan. Well, I'm a first-generation immigrant. I came here at the age of 5, and I often say that my children are the first generation in my family that have not had to flee their home in fear of persecution. So that's quite something for us to reflect on as a community. My father was originally from Germany. My mother came from Austria. And my father left Germany during the Depression because he couldn't get a job. My mother left Austria in pursuit of a boyfriend. So mythology tells us, family mythology tells me, got to Egypt, which is where my parents met. And the boyfriend turned out to be a Nazi, and her parents told her not to come back to Austria. So they met and married. And I'm one of 5, and 4 of us were born in Egypt. And then we had to, after the war, when Israel was created, life became pretty intolerable, I think, for Jews early on. I lost a lot of relatives, like many of you did, during the Holocaust, on both my father and my mother's side. And that, of course, has had an enormous impact, as it has on all of us. And I think I just want to tell one story, if I can, Jonathan, from those days. That one of them is my mother's mother stayed in Austria. She could have got out. She was in Vienna, but she was 57 at the time. And she just thought nobody would touch her. They'd leave her alone because she was so old. That's what she felt at the time. And then, of course, Hitler the Germans took over Austria, and she was evicted from her flat. She was put into a room in a house where she had to pay exorbitant rent, made to wear the Star of David. She didn't have enough money, and the various relatives abroad tried to send her money to feed herself. And she watched whilst 1,000 Jews were marched out of Vienna every week during that period. And then she eventually was taken, and she didn't even get into the concentration camp. She was shot in a trough outside Treblinka in that concentration camp. But the reason I tell the story is that just before she was killed, she sent a letter to my uncle, my mother's brother, who was then in America. And in that letter, we've just uncovered this letter. 2 of my sisters have been going through all the family, there's a lot of letters and diaries and things that we've been able to look through. And in that letter to her son, she says twice, "Don't forget me completely." And it's a very poignant letter that has sort of, I think, been a big influence, certainly in recent years for me. So in 1948, my dad had a stone thrown through the window of his office in Alexandria, where we were. And I think the Holocaust was still very raw in his memory, and he decided to get out. And nobody would accept us. We were a family. 4 of the children were born in Egypt. 1 was born in the UK. He tried to go to America. He tried to go to Australia. He tried to Canada. He'd obviously thought he wanted to go to an English-speaking country. And then the Brits were the only ones to accept us. So my parents were forever grateful to the Brits for accepting us. And were he alive today, my father would be completely gobsmacked, and I think really proud that I'd become such an establishment figure in British society. But we were brought up, we went to South London, not North London. And I think my parents they came from a background where they had integrated in both Germany and Austria. And they were really, really anxious that we should, be integrated into British society. They felt that very strongly. And they were completely irreligious. So going to Shul was not part of my childhood at all. And but the only thing that, obviously all our family friends were German and Austrian Jewish refugee families. So we grew up in this very refugee culture, but not in a sort of traditional Jewish culture around the school. Family has always been important to us. So I've always said, I say this jokingly, but there's an element of truth in this, that my Jewish identity was important, but it was never part of my value system or really part of the way in which I led my life. And I always say jokingly, my father tried to make me a little bit more Jewish and he failed. And the rabbi, our local rabbi, did have a go and he failed too. And then I went to the London School of Economics, and there were a lot of Jews there in the 60s when I was there, and they tried to make me more Jewish and they failed. And it took one Jeremy Corbyn to really push me back and make me my Jewish identity such an important part of everything I did and who I am. It's always been who I am, but it was never really, I always said I became a Labour MP who was Jewish. That's what I happened to be Jewish, but I am now very much a Jewish Labour MP.
Well, it's very interesting where you put that, because many people coming from refugee families didn't have so much consciousness in their childhood of the Holocaust. But you probably did have quite an awareness. I understand your mother died quite at a young age.
My mother died when I was 10. So all those sort of memories that mums tend to instill in their children are gone, really, which is very sad. But so I felt very much a refugee child. And I remember my dad always said to me, keep a suitcase by the door, Margaret, you'll never know when you need it. So that was sort of part of, again, the culture in which I was brought up. I mean, I got involved in Labour politics really because of my Jewish background. I think because of my immigrant background, to take it forward to that stage, if that's all right, Jonathan.
I was going to ask you, how drew you into politics? Was that at the LSE or subsequently? Who were your political mentors, as it were?
Oh, golly. Well, political mentors, I mean, actually, people like Nelson Mandela was my absolute hero, and Martin Luther King and people like that were the real ones that I looked at. But actually, within the Labour Party, Shirley Williams, who died recently, she was a very important figure to me. I always thought she was incredibly passionate and principled and articulate and thinking, and really, really great. It was a great loss to the Labour Party. I joined Labour. My dad was a Tory. My dad ran a steel business, and he nearly kicked me out of the house in 1964 when Labour came in and they were going to nationalise steel. I was really persona non grata. But I joined the Labour Party because I am an immigrant. I feel an outsider. I've always felt a bit of an outsider. And the Labour Party was the one that fought racism, that promoted equality, and that also had this other value, which I consider really important, of the international solidarity. So I'm a very strong European today, very sad that we have decided to move out of Europe. But I feel and those values drew me in. And we were saying a bit before, that's why I joined Labour. How I drifted into politics is really a bit daft. So I'd always been active in things like CND and anti-apartheid and anti-Vietnam marches. And, I did all those sort of things as a young person. And so when I started having children, which was in 1971, I got 4 children. And now 12 brilliant, wonderful grandchildren. But when I started having children, I used to do international research because I've got languages that I grew up with from Egypt. I'm a pretty good linguist. So I was doing international research. And then my first baby was born in 71. And in those days, you gave up in for the first 5 years of the child's life. And anyway, I couldn't travel with a baby. And I thought all I ever wanted to be was a mum. And then I sort of quickly found that much as I love the children, it wasn't enough for me. So I was active in the Labour Party locally. And a friend of mine who was actually Caldor's daughter, I don't know, some of you remember The Economist.
Nicholas Cal.
Yeah. Yeah, he was
The Economist, yeah.
Yeah, The Economist. He was an advisor to Harold Wilson.
Yes,
His daughter was active in Islington Labour Party in those days. And she was on the council. And she actually said to me, I was pregnant with my second child at the time. And she said to me, go on, Margaret, take over my council seat. It'll keep you sane whilst you're changing nappies. So it was wasn't the most ideological reason for becoming a local councillor, but once you're dragged into it, the only way I can describe it to people, it's a sort of drug which can be absolutely terrible, as the anti-Semitism can prove, but also if you do manage to achieve changes, it can be the most exhilarating and
take us back to the world of the 60s and 70s, because I think a lot of the younger people watching this have no idea, in comparison, how Jewish people were at home in the Labour Party of your childhood and early youth, and contrast it with the way things are today.
If you just look up on Google Jewish MPs, you will find that up until probably mid-late 70s, there were a lot of Jewish MPs, but the vast majority, almost all, were always Labour MPs. And one of the tragedies, particularly of the last 4 years with Jeremy Corbyn as our leader, is that I am now the only woman Jewish Labour MP left standing. I'm the only one left. So there's been a complete shift. Now, some of that came with Thatcher. I think, as Jews came in it's happening a little bit with all migrant communities. It comes out of that migration, I think. And Jews are sort of, culturally, we are pretty egalitarian in our approach to life. And we do have strong values about human rights and international solidarity. I think those are sort of commonly held views, really, in the Jewish community. So it was the natural home. Now, it started dissolving under Thatcher, if you look at the figures, but it is utterly shocking, and we'll come on to it, that the damage that Jeremy Corbyn did was to really almost expel. He made it a hostile environment for Jews.
When I was a child, there were 38 Labour MPs and 2 Conservative MPs. In the days of Keith Joseph and David Goldsmith, there were 2 Conservative MPs, 38 Labour MPs. I mean, it was astonishing. This is in the pre-Thatcher era. And if you look at the history of trade unionism in this country, the Jewish people were quite involved. You think of people like Manuel Schindler, and people don't have any idea today. Like in the sense that the Democratic Party in America was the natural home for the Jewish, and just to a large extent remains that way. Labour Party was the natural home for Jewish people. And people might be very surprised at that. You start.
Well, hopefully, we'll come back to that,
yes,
Jonathan.
Is
to draw you all back to it.
in Islington. Now, I think Jeremy Corbyn is the MP for Islington. You must have come across him in local government. How did you relate to him in the 1980s when he was probably a very left-wing MP, but was certainly never dreamt of leading the Labour Party?
Well, I became the leader in Islington in 1982. He became the MP for Islington North in 1983. And my early view of him was he was a sort of dishevelled, not really engaged. He was more interested in what was happening in Nicaragua than what was happening in the communities in Islington. And he never, I mean, I don't know if there are people here who are involved in local politics. Local politicians hate their MPs getting involved in local issues. And he never gave me any trouble. So I never really talked to him or engaged with him. He was just a non-entity, if I'm honest with you, Jonathan, a non-entity. And I'll tell you an interesting story about him, which I think reflects on him a lot. Is that about 2014, I left Islington in 92, although I still live in the area, but I withdrew from Labour politics in Islington. In 2014 or thereabouts, they asked me back to come to speak to a meeting about my work on the Public Accounts Committee. And I never talked to Jeremy in the House of Commons either, because he was just, we were in different places politically. But I was never rude to him. We had a perfectly civil relationship. But I came to this meeting, he introduced me, and I hadn't heard him speak for 20 years, more than 20 years. And as I sat there listening to him, what was so astonishing was that he not only expressed the same values that he'd held in 92, he used exactly the same language and terms that he'd used in 92. He just hadn't moved on. And one of the arts in politics is you retain your eternal values, your lasting values, equality, solidarity, fighting racism, those sort of things. But you make them relevant to the context of today. And he was never, ever able to do that. And then I have to say another thing about him, and it leads into the anti-Semitism. He always proclaimed himself as an anti-racist, but so in those days did Ken Livingstone. And I had a lot to do with Ken Livingstone. He was leader at the GLC. I was leader in Islington. I was leading really for Labour, for Neil Kinnock's Labour in London. So I had quite a lot of interaction with Ken, who was always hostile to that modernisation of the 80s, that creation of new Labour. And I used to go to meetings, and my maiden name is Oppenheimer, and Ken would sort of sneer something about my maiden name. And then my dad did do well in business, so there was a lot of family money in those days. Sadly, my brother let the business go to pot, but in those days, there was quite a lot of family money around, and he'd sneer about that. And I'd come home and I'd say to my husband, I don't know, it's really weird. I think Ken is anti-Semitic. And then I'd say, but he can't be because he's an anti-racist. So it took a lot of time for me to sort of, only now do I really understand how I misunderstood Ken Livingstone in the 80s. And then coming to Corbyn, now after he became leader, I opposed him because I oppose his politics. I just don't buy that sort of revolutionary anti-capitalism politics. But I never thought of him as an anti-Semite. And it was only from when he became leader in 2015 and the things that emerged after that, that I really realized.
I think it's really interesting you say that, because I think a lot of people, we couldn't believe, I think, that he would have such primitive views. We're incredibly surprised. What do you think were the factors that led to the growth of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? I think it's a very broad question. What were the other themes that have led to this development?
I find it difficult to explain, so all I can do is give you my take on it, and it may or may not be right. But there's always been a bit of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There is in the Conservative Party. It's always been on the fringes. What happened under Corbyn, and it moved from the fringes into the mainstream. And I think the reasons are this. The first one is Corbyn is deeply anti-capitalist, really, really anti-capitalist. And Jews, one of the eternal tropes is us as being financiers, and you can think of everything from Shylock through to the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds get more anti-Semitism than I think any Jewish family in Britain today. And we are deemed to be capitalist exploiters. And so that association between being Jewish and being capitalist turns you against the Jewish communities all, that trope in itself. So if you're anti-capitalist, you must be anti-Jewish. And then I think the second thing is Corbyn's politics is very anti-West, very pro-Russia, anti-NATO. all those sort of institutions. And the Jewish community, as you said a bit earlier on, is a pretty strong force, particularly in American politics. They're an influential force in the way that we're not here because we're a smaller community, but they are an influential force in American politics. So if you're anti-West, pro-East, you tend then to be anti-Semitic. And then the third thing is the obsession with Palestine. Palestine is the cause célèbre of the hard left and has been since probably the late 60s, since the Six-Day War and 70s, to the exclusion very often of every other terrible, terrible conflict across the world. And they cannot distinguish people on the left. They cannot distinguish between our Jewish identity, we are all Jews, and our commitment to Zionism, which I think is probably shared across most of the, not entirely, but most of the Jewish community, and then support for the current regime in Israel. And I'm not a paid up member of the Netanyahu fan club. I'm sure many of you aren't, and we are very concerned about some of the things that are happening in Israel. But there's a complete inability to distinguish between being Jewish and supporting Netanyahu. And I think those three factors, the anti-capitalist, the anti-West, and the pro-Palestinian, create anti-Semitism. That's my reading of it.
And the change in Israel at the time of Harold Wilson, you've got where he was, I would say, quite pro-Israeli, talking about organising the flotilla down through the Straits of Tiran.
Jonathan, I'm finding it rather difficult to hear.
1967. So can you hear me? I'm sorry.
That's better. I think you've got to speak in. I didn't hear the first bit too well. I'm really sorry.
Taking back to the world of Harold Wilson, who was very pro-Israeli. And it's perhaps inconceivable for people to realise that today.
As was Gordon, or is Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, and Keir Starmer.
Yes, well, that's encouraging to hear. But it's, of course, very difficult to see, very easy to cross over from being pro-Palestinian into being anti-Semitic. It's a very fine line to tread between being critical of Israel and perhaps being pro-Palestinian and not to be anti-Semitic. And I'm not sure it's a tenable line, or it's a very difficult line.
I think you can be critical of the Israeli government and still be a supporter of the state of Israel. I think you can do that. I think there are certain actions that I find rather difficult and just, I mean, a bit disturbing. The report that was published this week around the settlements and around the various democratic rights of Palestinians living in Israel, Israeli Palestinians. So I think you can be critical, but you've equally got to be understanding of the security problems, and understand the background to how we come to this. And I hope most of us in this room would be supportive of a two-state solution. So if you want to move in that direction, you've got to, get to a position where the two sides can engage to find a solution among themselves. Do that.
I found researching some of your views, because you once said that a fringe view had become a mainstream view, and I wonder to what extent that goes along with momentum. I think much greater influence in the Labour Party, becoming a party within the party. I was wondering, how was it that momentum was able to effectively almost take over the Labour Party?
Sorry for interrupting, but Jonathan, at the questions, you need to move a little closer to the microphone. It's blurring a little bit.
Okay. How was it that momentum was able to capture the Labour Party? How did it happen?
You talked about the 60s, and I think we have to just, there's always been both political parties are broad churches. We live in a two-party democracy, and the way that, the attempts to introduce the third party have failed throughout my political lifetime, which is pretty long. And so they are both broad churches. So there's always been there's an extreme right in the Conservative Party, which is in the ascendancy at the moment, and there's an extreme left in the Labour Party. I think I put myself back to what I felt when I first became active around 1970, 79, in the 70s, really. There was, as a young person, I was very disillusioned with the Wilson government by 1979. You know, I felt they cut public spending. We'd had Anthony Crossland uh, 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 sticking to the IMF and saying the party's over. There were all the industrial disputes, the winter of discontent. There was quite a lot. So in those days, I thought the Labour Party, I didn't know anything else. I hadn't seen another Labour government. The Labour Party had failed me. Put yourself in the position of young people, not the extreme trots who've always been around, but young people in 2010, 2015. They didn't know anything else than really Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And although I think there's been a magical legacy out of much that we did, there were bad things. There was the war in Iraq, which was very, very contentious, and which has proved to be less than a good decision. There was also the 2008 financial crisis, and then the public expenditure cuts that came with that, which impacted on young people's lives. And I think the mixture of those things, those two things, the war in Iraq and the 2008 crisis, created a disillusion with Blairism, with New Labour.
Yeah.
So when it came to choosing a leader, there was this funny old man who was offering a sort of message of hope and a much less managerial approach than perhaps came out of the other candidates. So I can see how young people were encouraged by that and were exploited then by the extreme left, the ultra left, the trots, who wanted to create revolution and who exploited this youth sort of hope to create momentum. But what is so interesting, and I never expected, I mean, I stayed, we might come to this as well. I chose to stay in the Labour Party because I was absolutely determined. The Labour Party's got a very proud history, which we've talked about a little bit, of over 100 years existence. The Jewish Labour movement is the longest affiliated organization to the Labour Party of any organization, has been affiliated for longer than any of the trade unions. And I was determined not to give up without a fight on the values that had brought me into the Labour Party and that had made it the successful government of Blair and Brown. I was determined to fight for those values and not allow the extremists to take it over. And I think when history looks back on this period, awful as it has been going through it, I think the judgment will be it was a 4 or 5 year period. It was a hiccup in a long, proud history. And, you know, we will now come back to those values, but make them relevant to the problems, issues that confront us today in our daily lives. So I can understand why the young people voted in 2015. They were exploited by the trots. The young people are now coming back into the mainstream, and we are rather quickly expelling the trots.
How did it feel at that time to be a Labour MP? Tell us a little bit about it and illustrate perhaps some of the instances that you endured as a Labour MP. We obviously admire your resilience enormously, having stayed and gone through that period.
It just, I mean, what was very odd is we came back in 2015 after being elected, and I didn't like his economics, his politics. I didn't like his anti-West. I didn't like his anti-capitalism stances. I hated all of that. But I suddenly started getting a lot of anti-Semitic abuse. And I hadn't been active in Jewish Labour politics, but I went and approached Luciana Berger and said, this is ridiculous. We've got to do something about it. That was really the start of it. It was the abuse I started to get. And so I then started to become active. And the abuse, what was different? Let me just put a tiny bit, sorry, Jonathan, to jump around a bit. In 2010, between 2006 and 2010, I fought the British National Party in Barking. So it's the extreme right in Barking. And of course I got abuse during that period. And it was pre-social media. So it was very different sort of nature of abuse. But one of the shocking things about the abuse was that literally the extreme left cut and pasted stuff that came out of BMP literature that was put through the doors of residents of Barking in 2009, 2010, cut and pasted it to attack me in 2018 and 2019. And when I became the last MP left standing, in that period last year, time goes so fast, when the EHRC report was published, and I fought like hell to ensure that Jeremy Corbyn was not allowed back into the Parliamentary Labour Party. I got something like, in a period of 2 months, 90,000 abusive communications on social media. I don't look at it. The CST actually monitor my social media for me. It wasn't all abusive, but that's 90,000. And I'm going to, if I may, I can't, but I just think people don't understand the extent of it. So I hope you've all got good stomachs, because this is really rude. But I'm just going to read to you a few of these. So some of it is openly anti-Semitic. So I got, for example, why has half of 1% of our population got so much power? Rid us of this cancer. That's from the left. Some of it is just is this issue about associating us with the left with the issue of Palestine, Israel. So I'm always called a Zionist stooge, a Zionist bitch. A swastika is appropriate, as Israel is a fascist state. Margaret Hodge is a Zionist pig, and hopefully Hezbollah will catch up with the bitch. And then some of it is just vile, and I apologize for this, but there are two things I'm going to read you. One is that something that came to both Ruth Smeeth and me. They're nothing but a couple of shit-stirring cum buckets, bought and paid for by Israel. About time these cretinous pieces of shit fucked off back under their stones. And the other one is, I want her to feel despised. It's what the bitch deserves. I hope somebody kills her. I really do. She's a lying, deceitful, hateful bitch who needs to be executed publicly so we can watch and laugh at her. The only support she deserves is a handrail to climb the gallows. The vile fucking cunt. So apologies for the rudeness of that, but that is regularly what comes through to me. Less of it, much less of it today than during this period.
This is criminal material which you're just citing.
The problem is CST do that for me and refer to the police if necessary. And we've tried 1 or 2 cases. It's very difficult. You're a lawyer, but it is extremely difficult. Which is why I'm going to be active on there's a new bill coming to Parliament around harmful online abuse, and I'm going to be really active in trying to get the definitions, legal definitions, rather tighter, and actually deal with anonymity. Quite a lot of it is anonymous.
It must have been very tempting to do the same as Luciana Berger and Louise Ellman and leave the party. But you stayed. I suppose you thought that the time would come when Corbyn would go, and you needed to
well, I mean, you can fight racism in lots of ways, and I could completely. I mean, you know, Louise Ellman in particular has been a long-standing friend of mine, where we both came into politics about the same time. We were both leaders in local government around the same time. So we've known each other for a long, long time. And I totally respect their decisions that they made. But I just wasn't prepared to allow Corbyn to take over our party. What I did promise myself, and what I will share with you now, was 2 things. I mean, had he not lost the leadership election in 2019, or had one of his side won it, had Rebecca Long Bailey won it, I'd have gone. And the other thing I had promised myself, because I know that Jews were very frightened, the best result that Labour might have thought about would have been a hung parliament in 2019. I never thought it would happen. But what I had promised myself, and I had discussions with one or two of like-minded colleagues in Parliament, had it happened that it was a hung parliament and had Corbyn been asked to form a government, I would at that point, together with a few colleagues, and in a hung parliament, you've got special power, you've got extra power, I would have ensured that he never became our prime minister, either by voting with the Conservatives on a vote of no confidence or voting against a budget. There would have been a way in which we could have ensured he never became prime minister. So everybody takes their own route. But I hope history will, I hope history will, pay tribute to all. I mean, it was horrible for all of us. It was a very lonely battle, walking into.
Remembering that election, the chief rabbi made an unparalleled intervention by and publicly criticizing Corbyn as the person he didn't feel was fit to be prime minister. I was quite, in a sense, surprised that he made that intervention. Do you think that cut through to non-Jewish voters? Do you think it had influence?
I think he influenced Jewish voters. I don't think he influenced, anti-Semitism had an influence. A lot of people said to me during those 3 or 4 years, even people who weren't anti-Semitic used to say to me, just shut up about it, Margaret. We've got to concentrate on, Brexit. Brexit was the other very, very big issue. Anti-Semitism is a difficult term in itself. A lot of people don't actually understand the term. But I can tell you that when I was door-to-door campaigning in my own constituency, and I went and helped some friends of mine, who were who might have had problems in other constituencies, people talked about, oh yeah, it's a nasty party. We were seen to be a nasty party. And I often talk about Jew hate rather than anti-Semitism, because that's an easier concept for people to get their head around. But I think it cut through. I'm not sure the rabbi cut through beyond the very, very far beyond the Jewish community. But I think feeling that it was a nasty party, much as it was, in the time in the post-97 period for the Tories, I think that really did cut through to a lot of voters.
Turning to the era of the current leader of the Labour Party, do you feel that there has been a real change? Or to what extent do you feel that anti-Semitism has been rooted out, or there's a to-do list still? How would you respond to that?
There is still, I can't tell you the relief I personally feel, and the joy I feel that Keir Starmer is our leader. To be absolutely honest, I didn't vote for him. I voted for Lisa Nandy because I wanted a woman, and I think she's very charismatic and a good communicator. But I'm delighted, particularly on the anti-Semitism, which I think she would have done too, but I'm very delighted at the way that Keir Starmer has responded to that. However, and he does, one of the first people he rang a few people on the day that he became leader. I was one of them. And I know that other Jewish activists in the Labour, Ruth Smeeth also got a telephone call. So those of us that had stayed in the Labour Party and tried to fight from the inside, he acknowledged us literally within hours of getting leadership. Has it gone? No, because once you allow that culture to move from the fringes to the mainstream, you've got a lot of work to do to expel it again. But is he taking the rights? And there are problems he's got. That, for example, after that terrible EHRC report, we have got to set up a new complaints mechanism that is not subject to influence from politicians. But he's inherited the Corbyn mechanism, and he's inherited at the moment a lot of people who sit on those panels considering complaints about anti-Semitism who are Corbynites. They were people who were elected by our last party conference, which was in 2 years ago now because of COVID. So he's got to change that system, and he's got to He's got to change the people. And I think there's also a massive education and cultural task that he has to undertake, if I'm right in my analysis of what created the anti-Semitism. And the Jewish labor movement are in the middle now of rolling out a very extensive training. I call it an anti-Semitism awareness program, because a lot of people just don't get it. It's such a unique form of racism. It's difficult for a lot of people to comprehend. So there's a massive anti-Semitism awareness training program that is now being rolled out by the Jewish labor movement. But even just today, I mean, before I came here, 14 people were expelled today. Some of them holding elected office. They were suspended. They weren't expelled, they suspended today. And I just noticed the difference. First of all, if I do put in a complaint, there's a very, very quick response. And it's just the culture. And I can finally work with my colleagues in the political party. I can talk to them about it. I'll tell you this Corbyn story because people like to hear it. The story with the actual Corbyn himself is slightly wrongly interpreted in the press. What happened that night is we were in the House of Commons, one of these nights when we were endlessly voting on Europe. And it was Corbyn, being what he was, had chosen that day, although they were key votes on Europe, to have a National Executive Committee meeting to discuss the ARA definition of anti-Semitism. And it came back to us as we were hanging around the lobby that he had rejected the ARA definition. And I was absolutely furious. We'd worked really, really hard to put pressure on him to adopt it. And I was with two of my young male colleagues behind the speaker's chair, and we were talking about it. And I did say, I'm going to tell him he's an effing anti-Semitic racist. And these two young men said to me, go on, Margaret, go for it. And Corbyn was still in the chamber. And I said, no, I'm going to wait till he comes out and do it then. And they hustled away. I waited, he came out. And the last thing I said to myself is, don't swear, because that undermines the potency of your assault. So I did say to him, I went up and I said, you are an anti-Semitic racist, and you've made the party a hostile environment for Jewish people. And he is sort of passive aggressive, so he can't engage. So we had a 2 or 3 minute, he said to me, would I read recommendation 36B on page 74? And I said, it's not what you say, Jeremy, it's what you do. And by that time, there'd been a lot of evidence, from the cartoon onwards of his anti-Semitism. And that was the end of the conversation. And I was clearly a bit shaken by this, because a few of my colleagues took me off and gave me a glass of water. And then I went off to the theatre and saw a brilliant play, but I turned off my phone and I just didn't think about it again. I thought, okay, I've had my say and it's horrible. What do I do next? And as I came out of the theatre, I turned my phone back on. And of course, it had gone ballistic, because one of the colleagues with whom I'd had the conversation before I confronted Corbyn had gone off and told the Huffington Post. Then the end of the story is that the following morning, it went bananas. The following morning, I had terrible toothache. So I'd got an appointment with the dentist, but the phone hadn't stopped ringing, and it was all sort of going on. And so I took one of my research assistants to the dentist with me, and she was sitting in the waiting room. And then I was having treatment, and she comes in and she says, Luciana's on the phone, Margaret, you've got to talk to her. And I was literally lying back in the dental chair with my mouth wide open. And I thought, I can't. She said, you've got to. And then Luciana, so I did. And Luciana said, they're going to suspend you from the Labour Party. And that was really the reality of that story. It's got different.
It gets into Wikipedia, but as you making the actual expletive deleted, rather than not having made it.
Trouble with Wikipedia is it's very difficult to get. It's very inaccurate in lots of ways, but it's very difficult to amend it.
So coming back to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, has the Labour Party or the NEC now adopted it? Or
Yes.
It has adopted it without the reservations.
Yes.
So it has changed.
Yeah.
Because I think the Jewish community would be very interested to know, to what extent these changes are reversible under a new leader. If Rebecca Long Bailey or Lisa Nandy became leader of the Labour Party, let's say Keir Starmer doesn't work out in the next couple of years, will things go back to what they were?
Well, Lisa Nandy is not Rebecca Long Bailey, right? Lisa Nandy is a very, very strong supporter. She is one of the few people during those 4 lonely years who did stand up and was counted in supporting us in our battle against anti-Semitism. So I won't have a word said against her. She is a comrade to us in these issues. The second thing is honestly that what has been surprising to me, I never expected, because I fought militant in the 80s, and it took us a long time. It took us from 83 round to about 92, 93. It took us 10 years to really transform the party into the successful new Labour party that then won 3 elections in a row. What has been amazing this time is how quickly the trots have disappeared, the real troublemakers have disappeared, and how very quickly the young people who came in supporting Corbyn because he gave them this feeling of hope have joined the mainstream. So I don't think at the moment, of course, you can never say never. And you've just got to look at populism across the world. Look at Trump. Look at actually, I mean, dare I say it, Boris Johnson a little bit, not as, not in the same way as Trump, and look across, whether you go to Hungary, you can go to all sorts of places across the world. The rise of populism allows these sort of extremists with their terrible views to gain authority. And we're also in a very odd area where people now vote on sort of identity issues. You can see it all, the issues which determine people's voting patterns are very different today from what they were 10 years ago, when people used to vote from sort of economic self-interest, and it was that was the driver. Now it's, get Britain back, it's anti-immigration, it's those sort of values and identity issues that determine people's voting behavior. It's a different era.
Before opening this up to other people, a number of attendees of this session are going to be sending their children to universities. And I think you were a minister at one stage for universities, and are concerned about growing anti-Semitism on the campuses and attacks on free speech. And we've had many examples of it. I mean, last year Amber Rudd was cancelled from a meeting in Oxford, which I find it very surprising. We had a few days ago the Provost of University College London saying that he needs to organise as a course for students to understand how to engage in normal discourse, political discourse. I mean, it's quite a strange development when you have a major university, provost of a major university, saying we actually have to train our students to actually talk to each other in a civilized manner. What advice would you give parents wanting to send their children to universities today?
Well, among the many things I do, as I chair the council of a university as well. I chair Royal Holloway down in Egham, the women's, what was a women's college originally, Royal Holloway in Bedford. It's an amalgam of the 2 colleges. I mean, you didn't talk about Bristol, where you've got the academic there who was, clearly anti-Semitic, and where the university authorities have failed to take actions. I think, first of all, the Amber Rudd sort of situation is so rare. You don't put that on all universities. It happens, but it happens so rarely. It's right. One bad apple doesn't make the whole thing completely. On the whole, universities are open institutions that encourage democratic debate. And whilst where it happens, it should be stamped on, it shouldn't be taken to reflect, I think, the culture that exists in our academic institutions for our young people. The ARA definition is now being adopted gradually by all universities, encouraged to do so by John Mann, who's become our anti-Semitic champion on behalf of all of us, and encouraged to do so by the government. So I think that in a way will give added comfort. And this issue of free speech is one that we have to, it's a difficult one to define, and we have to tread extremely carefully. That, free speech doesn't, enabling free speech, but preventing abuse and racism is that line that we have to tread very, very, very carefully. And you've just got to try and work with young people to help them develop the skills and the understanding and the sensitivity that in the way in which they work and in their social and cultural life, they respect free speech, but they also respect people of different cultures. They don't promote hate or
because I think I probably asked too many questions, and there are other people wanting to participate. So
right.
Would you perhaps ask some questions that others have raised? I probably monopolized.
We'll only have enough time for one question, as we would like to finish at 9 o'clock. But the many questions have been asked by Jonathan automatically. But one question is, Margaret, did you ever think of standing for the leadership of the Labour Party, or was ever encouraged by colleagues to do so, either against Corbyn or to be his successor?
Oh, I would have stood against Corbyn if they'd wanted me to. I don't think I was the best candidate to see him off, but I would have had absolutely no problem seeing that. You might have got from me tonight, I'm a person who tends to say things, I say it as it is. I said it as it is when I thought the BNP embarking, and I said it as it is when I thought the anti-Semitism in Labour. So I don't think I'm the best person to be leader of the Labour Party. I feel I've had a very privileged working life. I've had, experiences that I could never have dreamt of as a sort of immigrant child coming to Britain at the age of 5. Never leader, but I've enjoyed every job I've done, and every job I've done in government, I left a legacy, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of what people do in government.
Okay, I'll say it how it is too. Margaret, thank you for an amazing talk. You're truly an inspiration. As I said before we got on, that many people are bystanders, but it's rare to have an upstander, and to that in the proud tradition of our people is something incredibly special. Jonathan, thank you very much for your amazing interviewing skills. I think we now have a full-time job for you. If nothing else works out, you could, or if everything else works out, you can be the Shul's main interviewer. But thank you everybody for joining. And Margaret, again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for giving us your time and your grace and your courage to not just this community, but to the Jewish community at large, and indeed the world at large, showing them you have to stand up for anti-Semitism and indeed any oppressed people. Have a wonderful night, everybody. And Jonathan and Margaret, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I will. You're getting lots of virtual claps if you look.
Well, I wish you all well. And I'd love, one day I'd love to come and see your shul. I'm sure it's absolutely beautiful.
You're welcome to this weekend. You can come any other weekend too. Let me know. We'll run out the red carpet. You might get some talent as well, if depends.
Margaret, I must ask you one last question. Do you think that Corbyn will be regarded by history as one of the fathers of Brexit?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. I think if Corbyn had taken a different view, we wouldn't have lost the referendum.
I think that's and also you might have had a second referendum if you'd taken different stance.
Might have had a second referendum. We might have accepted the Theresa May deal. There are all sorts of might-haves that could have happened, which would at least have kept us in the mark. There's all sorts of things which would have been better. And it's interesting today. Sorry, this is politics a bit more generally, but it is interesting today that with the resignation of the DUP. In the Northern Ireland DUP, it's the beginning of the unraveling of false promises around what Brexit will deliver. It's the first one. It's the first one. They promised no border in Ireland, and they've got a border, and that's undermined her position. Yes. But there we are. There we are. We've just got to build a better Britain for the future.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you, thank you. I know the golden rule in being a rabbi is it's okay if you start shul late, but if you finish late, everybody complains.
They want to go to the
complain and
football.
start late. So the same thing. Have a great night, everybody. God bless you all, and thank you, Margaret. Thank you,
Okay.
Jonathan.
Thank
All the
you.
best.
Bye-bye.